Hello, everyone. I'm Susanna Shapiro. Welcome to our first episode of the Collective Now podcast. Collective Now is a project to build a world with joy and justice. We believe the only way we can do this is by working together across lines of difference. It can sometimes feel disheartening to look around and see rising inequality, individualism, authoritarianism, and ecological collapse. But there are alternatives. In this podcast, we will explore some of these and learn from people and groups working to create a better world. Collective Now is also a passion project. It's all volunteer, and what we're hoping to do is connect and amplify voices that are not usually heard in the US, and just see what's possible. Today, I'd like to welcome our first guest, Ashish Kothari. Thank you so much for being here today. Ashish is an Indian environmentalist, ecologist, activist, and author and scholar. I first read his stuff 25 years ago in grad school, so it's a very big honor to be here with him. He's worked for social and environmental justice on every level, from grassroots to international tribunals. We invited you because your work is very inspiring, and frankly, we need inspiration at a time like this. So, first, I just want you to introduce yourself a little more and help us get to know the context and the environment within which you work.
I have been working broadly on environment issues, and as we go along, I think I'll be able to explain more on what we mean by environment. Since my high school days, when we started in New Delhi, started by some activist work on protecting the urban forests of New Delhi, but also a whole bunch of other things. And then from there, getting involved more and more with some of the grassroots rights movements, livelihoods movements, ecological movements in India and then abroad. And starting the organization Kalpavriksh when I was in high school with others with which I still work. So it's been a long and fascinating journey. In the first few years itself, I think we learned that working on environment is not just about trees and tigers and urban forests and so on. It is that, but it is also about people's rights, people's livelihoods, gender issues, issues of who defines what is development, who takes decisions, so issues of governance, democracy, cultural rights, and so on and so forth. So for myself, for the first 3 decades or so, I worked a lot on conservation policy and livelihoods rights linked to conservation policy and trying to shift within India and globally conservation away from the top-down government-led, so-called expert-led wildlife conservation to much more community-led, indigenous people and community-led conservation. And that, of course, means a whole bunch of other things also. And then in the last 20 years, combining the work we were doing earlier, I was doing a lot of work on critiquing development and ecological policy relating to development. So in the last 15 years, 20 years or so, shifting a lot to my own focus has now been on radical alternatives to development. I continue to retain a lot of interest in the rights of nature, but defined in a very different way from how it's defined in the global north.
So, yes, you've written about our kind of the dominant economic system, endless growth, corporate power, and concentrated wealth, and how it's a failed experiment. We can see that's true. And at this point, I think most of the US recognizes that we need an alternative or more than one alternative. So can you really share a little bit more about what alternatives you're talking about? What have you seen? Some of the models that you've witnessed or participated in?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just a minute on why we think we need the alternatives in the first place. I mean, we know why, in the sense we're seeing ecological collapse all over the world, the globe, climate collapse, increasing inequalities, authoritarianism, war, genocide, you name it. We're in the midst of all of these crises and they're intersecting. But also that we realized early on that these are symptoms, but they're symptoms of much deeper flaws in the structures that we are at the moment dominated by. Those could be structures of old forms of patriarchy, racism, and casteism in India and elsewhere. But also then, of course, capitalism, state domination, and the maybe 200-300 years or 400 years old feeling that human beings have the right to dominate the earth. So anthropocentrism or human centrism. So if you think of these sort of fundamental structures and relations of oppression and unsustainability, For us, alternatives have to be alternatives which are not just superficial. They're not simply saying, okay, we're creating waste, so let's do recycling. The alternatives are where we actually say what are the structures and relations where human beings can regain our being a very much a part of nature, and therefore also respecting all of nature, just like we want our rights to be respected, therefore also respecting the rights of all of nature, but also how human beings can actually coexist with each other much better. And that means, of course, that in the diversity of cultures and knowledge systems and languages and food systems and so on that we have, sustaining that diversity and also ensuring that there is coexistence as in mutual respect, dignity, solidarity, etc. So for us, those are the alternatives, which means then fundamental transformations and paradigm shifts, for instance, in economics, where in the last, especially the last maybe 60, 70, 80 years, this whole model of development based on economic growth, which has come from a certain paradigm of economics and a certain paradigm of domination by the imperial nations, has to be replaced by an economics that is about well-being. It is about well-being of the planet, first of all, and it is about well-being of all of us and all the species that we live with. So that's a total transformation of the economic system. But the same thing also with systems like, for instance, nation states. It is natural to be divided up into these countries or these nation states. There's nothing natural about it. It's actually very, very unnatural, and it's an outcome and accompaniment to the growth of capitalist economies. And you can see that more and more now, where governments are hand in glove with the most powerful corporations of the world, which is why all of us are in big trouble, right? So what we are saying is that we also need, therefore, alternative forms of governance and even democracy. Now, democracy to us, those of us who are seeking alternatives, is not about going to vote once in 4 years or 5 years and vote a political party or a president into power. For us, democracy is about us claiming the rights of decision making where we are as local people, as communities, as collectives, or whatever, and power actually going up rather than top down. And that's a very different form of democracy. But so, in that sense, alternatives are very systemic, they're very structural, they're very relational. They are not just superficial answers to the problems that we have today.
Yeah. So we're kind of very behind because in the US, we've sort of been just, people have been sort of just surviving well enough to not look outward, to not really seriously consider alternatives. Like the Tina, there is no alternative mindset. So I think kind of that's why it's particularly interesting to hear from you. And just thinking about sort of where we're at in this sort of much more less advanced idea of alternatives, we do a lot of protesting, right? So recently, I mean, there's stuff going on all over that is highly energetic and there's joy. And even though there's misery, there's coexisting with joy, like in Tennessee, in Indianapolis. May 1st, we had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, like they're done, they're enough. So there's a lot of protest and dissatisfaction, but then there's the question of like, what now? What are we trying to build?
Well, let me start with maybe some examples that I've seen, some initiatives that I've seen on the ground, right? Because that's the best thing, to actually tell stories of what's happening around. And of course, I know mostly stuff in India, but also a few from elsewhere. I'll just give a couple from India and then maybe one or two from outside, and then from there build what are the sorts of systems that we think should actually grow out of these sorts of grounded initiatives. So number one, I also want to say that this is not about bringing some sort of theory down to the ground. Now that's to my mind, and for a lot of us, that's the wrong approach. It's really about what is it that people are doing on the ground, and then from there, the concept, their own concepts and other concept emerging from that practice and that sort of. So there's, for me, the most inspiring example in India is over the last 30 years, Dalit, that is the so-called outcasts of the Indian caste system, women farmers. Okay, so they're triple disprivileged as Dalits in the caste system, as women in a patriarchal system, and as very small scale farmers, 1 to 2 acres of land. So in all different ways, they're marginalized. Till about 30, 35 years back, this group of about 5,000 Dalit women farmers in South India in the state of Telangana were severely malnourished. They had bouts of hunger. They did not have any access to the formal school and health systems. They were socially marginalized, etc. Then they got together. Many of the older women said, we need to do something about it. And they were remembering their own older forms of agriculture, where they were growing with no chemicals and nothing, with their own seeds and millets, which is the oldest grains in places like India. They were self-sufficient, relatively self-sufficient. Then they were marginalized in many different ways historically. So they said, can we bring those seeds back and do it in a collective way? We can't individually, none of us can actually do this, right? So about 60, 70 villages, they formed women's committees. And these committees brought back a lot of the seeds. They found that many of the older women were still preserving those seeds as heirloom seeds, hiding them under their cots, even though they were not growing them, but they were there, right, in clay pots. So they brought that back. They collectivized their operations. They shared the seeds. They shared knowledge of how to grow. They created grain banks in 60, 70 villages, and they did a whole bunch of other things. It's a very long story. I'm cutting it short. Over a period of about a decade, they actually achieved food security, about 5,000 families. But beyond that, then they said, we don't want just food security. Fundamental transformations means that we want food sovereignty, which means that as farmers, as Dalit women, we should have full control over everything to do with food, from the growing to the consumption, which means the land, the seeds, the knowledge, the water, etc. And which they did, right? So over this period, then they created their own media unit. They make their own films. They started their own. India's first community radio station was started by them. Let me take a second example quickly. This is in central India. Now we move to, let's say, Adivasis, or what we call Adivasis, which is the indigenous people of India. And here in central India, which is heavily forested and is the sort of stronghold of indigenous people, they have again been very severely exploited and marginalized during the colonial times by the British and then subsequent to independence also. So in the last 2 or 3 decades, again, they have mobilized themselves to take back control over the forests, collective control, and use it in a way that actually sustains the forests and their biodiversity, but also generates much better livelihoods for them. But they've also moved to change their governance patterns, building on the forms of governance where elders, there was a whole lot of respect for elders and there were processes involved and a lot of much more direct democracy, but also building in some elements from the Indian Constitution and saying, this is for us, we will be self-governing, we will be autonomous, even as we are within the Indian nation. You move over into another example, which I'd visited a few months back, and I'm going again next month, is the Amadiba people in South Africa. Now, the Amadiba have been doing self-governance and self-determination for at least 1,000 years, all through the Zulu kings, all through the apartheid regime, and all through the current South African government. They refuse to accept any diktat from outside. And this includes, over the last 20 years, resistance to mining by an Australian company, oil and gas exploration by Shell Corporation, a proposed smart city, and a huge expressway that is proposed to go through their land. So far, successfully resisted all of this. And what they sell, when the government comes and says, hey, you guys are poor, so all of this will bring development to you and you'll get jobs and all. Their response is, look, we hold all of this land in collective. There's no private property there, by the way. And for us, we are not poor because we have land and we have each other and we have the ocean. Now, so what they're doing is overturning even the notions of what is poverty and what does it mean to be rich or wealthy. And this is why it's important to also remember origins of words. The word wealthy comes from being well. Doesn't necessarily mean having lots of money. Okay, but that's how it's become in the dominant system. Anyway, so this is their response. And then, of course, they also need to move a little bit into the modern system. So they have started some home-based ecotourism and some other sort of things where they can also earn some revenues as necessary. Then moving further north into, say, the Kurdish movement, which is the one maybe you were referring to, which is in the midst of war-torn Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, that quarterly junction there, 30 to 40 million people, I think, the Kurds ethnically. And they have, in the last few decades, they started by saying we want our own nation, but very soon they actually moved away from that because they said if we start our own nation, there'll be again a national government and there'll be again people ruling over us. We don't want that. So we want an independent zone called Kurdistan. And in Kurdistan, there will be no centralized state. They don't want a state at all. There will be democracy, which is ground up. So every municipality, every local community will govern itself. And they will connect over the larger landscapes through various different institutional structures, but maintaining the power on the ground. But also that they will do this through what they call genealogy, which is the science of women's revolution. So as an eco-feminist philosophy, working with and within the earth, with each other, with also other ethnic communities. They don't want to say that just because we are a majority in some places, therefore others like the Yazidis and Christians and so on should be marginalized. They should also be part of it. Every one of their institutions has both genders or multiple genders as equal partners, etc. So if you think of that, but they're constantly in trouble, constantly being bombarded. You know what's happening in Syria right now. Before that, or even now, actually, Turkish side, there's bombardment. So it's a incredible experiment, but always in trouble. Anyway, so I don't want to go on and on. I can actually spend hours on stories. But I think if you look at these stories, what they tell us is that if, for instance, the movements in the United States want to really move towards radical alternatives, they have to look at these. They have to try and understand that what we're not trying to do, what we're trying to do is not simply change policy, get a better president of India, of the United States or whatever, which shouldn't be very difficult given how this guy is, but that doesn't necessarily change things dramatically, right? But to say, how can our own community self-govern to the level, to the extent it's possible? And then how do you coordinate across larger landscape, larger bioregions? There's a whole bioregionalism movement, which is also strong in the US, especially amongst indigenous peoples and others. So how do we move beyond nation state boundaries? How do we reconnect nature and culture across, let's say, the US and Canada, which some of the indigenous peoples on the borders are trying to do? The same here. In South Asia, we're saying, for us, a radical alternative would be where South Asia actually becomes a region governed with respect to river flows, mountain ecosystems and their connections, wildlife populations moving back and forth, nomadic pastoral communities being able to move freely as they used to do before the nation state boundaries got created, fishing communities being able to move back and forth. It's a long term vision, it's a difficult vision. But unless we do that, we're simply going to be going from one problematic regime to another problematic regime. That is not enough. But even in the US, there are movements like that, right? We've been in touch with, for instance, Jackson Corporation, just doing some fantastic economic cooperatives, also saying, how do you get actually self-governance for a town like Jackson and beyond? So everywhere we have these sorts of initiatives. Our thing is, how do you cross exchange? How do you learn from each other? And how do you dream and envision societies which are radically different?
I want to ask you about the sort of, that kind of leads me to wonder about that, the tapestry of alternatives, which it's sort of how to kind of link them. But even before that, just kind of noticing from these examples, people are not necessarily, it's not necessarily new, but they're tapping into parts of themselves, parts of their heritage, and parts of their nature, whether it's the seeds or like that they haven't really tapped into because the dominant structure might have been too limiting. And then once they tap into it, they can create their own narratives around their self-determination around other things, as opposed to be defined by like someone else's idea of wealth. So I think that's really critical, recognizing how to use the resources, like in some way, use our internal resources. Because in some way, capitalism and our dominant system is based on one of the human instincts of individual self-maximization. And that's like really not our general original instinct. So if we can even reconnect with more of ourselves, it's like clearly this will become less relevant, I think.
And you're right also that every society has some of that memory. Even the most industrialized capitalist societies actually have some of that memory. So maybe that explains some of what's happening as a reaction to, for instance, what the US government is doing in terms of military and paramilitary and police and so on, or what is it called, ICE. And the sort of community neighborhood solidarities that are emerging from that is actually tapping into that memory. So you're absolutely right about that. And I think here it's not just tapping into human memory; it's also tapping into nature's memory. This is very, very important for us. And many indigenous peoples across the world will actually tell us this, that when we take decisions, when we live our lives, we're living our lives in constant conversation with the rest of nature. And many of us in our urban industrialized life have forgotten how to do it, but it's there somewhere deep down in us, actually in our bodies. If we can think of how do we recall our bodily memories, which have evolved over generations, right? How do we recall the memory of us being part of nature? And if you look at it, a rainforest, brilliant in just the flourishing of life, extremely wealthy from a well-being point of view, but there's no central rule. There's no one central, big, huge, massive tree that's saying, okay, this is how the rainforest will work. It's distributed and it works beautifully until we as humans go and destroy it. It works beautifully. So why can't our systems also work like that? And this is exactly what the Kurdish movement is arguing, saying that we can work without states, without centralized control. We have to follow what we have learned from nature, which unfortunately we have unlearned too much in the last couple of 100 years.
Yeah. And even beyond collective memory, really just it's our human nature. Like if we remove the barriers to tapping into that, you even walk into a forest and you feel way different than if you're sitting in an apartment. So I think that's like really, really powerful. The other thing, because I work as a social worker, as a therapist, in addition to doing some activism, and it's like the brain changes. So if we're immersed in all these kind of capitalistic tendencies, our brain will change. However, there's neuroplasticity, so our brain can change back, but we have to be exposed to different ideas and we have to actually practice, like engage in the act of practicing. So relationships and experiences will change our brain. So I think that's very hopeful in terms of, really tapping into our nature. It's not impossible. And you mentioned some of the grassroots efforts, Cooperative Jackson, and also mutual aid, which taps into our own nature and like supporting each other through these traumatic ice raids. I want to hear more about the whole networking around this and radical localization, other types of things you've worked on.
Like you mentioned about individualism, is to kind of reconnect with each other as humans, but also with the rest of nature as collectives. That's not just about doing alternatives, it's really about life as a whole. And during the COVID pandemic, I think a lot of people realized this. Because if you are sitting alone at home and you had no access to collective services, you really had a bad time. But if you had access to collective services, or if you had a community, neighborhood system in which some young people would go and, for instance, in India, there was a whole bunch of young people who started a cycling service, cycle a medicine service. So they would actually individually cycle to medicine shops and come and bring it to older people in their neighborhoods or wherever they were. So that became quite a big movement in India during the COVID pandemic. And people realize that this can only happen if people have that solidarity, they have that connect, that human connect to each other and saying, okay, if an old person is suffering, I would like to go and help, even if I don't know this person. So mutual aid, as you mentioned, solidarity, all of that, expressions of support are something that is there in us, but it gets hidden. And it's also a thing of where the modern capitalist economy makes us scared. They make us fearful of other people. They make us fearful of situations. They make us distrustful of other people, which is the complete opposite. Now, if I go into the Himalaya and I walk into a village, people will welcome me into their houses and say, well, please come and have a meal or please come and have chai. In a city, I can't imagine calling somebody from the street and saying, hey, come and have a cup of tea with me. My first thing will be, oh, distrust, or maybe this guy will steal from my house or whatever, right? And that's why you see more and more and more of these gated colonies with a sentry in the front and sort of barbed wire fences. So this this deliberate thing of creating fear of each other, which then leads to, of course, more capitalist consumption and so on and so forth as a means of letting off steam, is something also that we have to deal with. And the only way to deal with it is to create these collectives of mutual aid and trust. Now, in terms of the attempts, so if one wants to move away from individualism in one's individual life, but also individualism as movements, which is the other big problem we have, NGOs, everybody wants to do their own thing and have their own name and so on, is to move beyond that and say, look, us as Kalpavriksha cannot possibly achieve the kind of things we want to achieve because the mega forces that are bearing down on us are too big. We have to be able to be part of, create or be part of networks of 100 organizations that try and do something together. And that can't work only in India. It has to work globally because we are a global system, for good or bad. So we started many such networks in India. There was one on conservation and livelihoods, but just personally in the last 15 years or so, 14 years, we started in India called a network in India called Vikalp Sangam, which means the confluence of alternatives. So it's really a sacred space where groups that are struggling on all these different fronts in different sectors, education, health, conservation, etc., can come together, share, collaborate, do joint actions, do joint visioning, do joint advocacy, etc. And there are about 100, almost 100 organizations involved in this. Learning from this and knowing of somewhat similar experiments happening in Colombia, Mexico, Southeast Asia, South Africa, etc., we started talking about the global tapestry of alternatives back in 2016 and then launched it in 2019 as a global attempt to do the same thing. So movements of, say, radical ecofeminism or movements of youth wanting a different future, movements of community-led conservation, movements of worker unions who are actually fighting not just to get better wages, but fighting fundamentally to change the industrial system, trying to bring a lot of these together to be able to work at global levels to affect change at the global level, learn from each other, collaborate, seed more such initiatives on the ground, always remain rooted on the ground, but also think and act sort of globally. So that's the idea. It's relatively new. And the other thing with that is that in Kalpuriksh, in Vikalp Sangam, and in the global tapestry of alternatives, we've also said that what we are asking and demanding of the outside world is something we should also be able to practice. So, for instance, if we are saying that we want a very different democracy, which is distributed, which is horizontal in the outside world, then we should be able to practice that in our own organizations. So if you look at Vikalp Sangam and the global tapestry, there's no central decision-making body. Decision-making is the assembly as a whole, which means all the groups that are involved come together. Now, that's sometimes unwieldy, but we feel that's much more powerful. And that's been one of the big problems with even the left movements. We've had some fantastic left movements all across the world, leftist movements. But at that global level, they've had these internationalists and so on, right from the time of Marx and Engels and all. But they have been heavily taken over by, a centralized Politburo kind of system. And for us, that is not the way to go. So this is also what we're trying in these different networking and collective systems. Trying, I'm saying trying. It's not easy. So of course, we make mistakes and we have to constantly learn from them.
Yeah, it's not easy and it is a process.
One of the things, again, just to put this into the perspective, is that for us at the global tapestry, it's very important that this is a global process that's led from the global south and not from the global north. So in fact, there's a lot of focus on Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but that's not to exclude the global north. There are fantastic things happening as we, cooperative actions is one of them. We have a number of groups in the US, in fact, who are also endorsers or members of the facilitation team. There's the Alternatives Project, there's May 1st Technology. So our attempt is to say, okay, if there are such groups anywhere in the world, including in the global north, we need to ally with them or we need to get them to ally with us. But the leadership, and I'm saying leadership in inverted commas, because I want to make sure that we're still talking about a horizontal way of doing things. But, in that sense, the tone is set from the global south. This to us is really, really important because otherwise, unfortunately, most global international movements also tend to get dominated by the global north because that's where the resources are, that's where the language is, etc. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think this idea of centralizing it as like leading in the South, global South, is not just beneficial to the global South, it's actually beneficial to the entire world because clearly the way that was working wasn't really working. Yes, not being yet another voice in the whole big, ecosystem of nonprofits or not, and not just being one big homogenized movement and not being divisive, but actually saying, hey, let's try to be an alternative ourselves and let's try to link up and try to even connect them. So in some way, we're looking at the Vikalp Sangam and like as a ideal model in the future, not right away, because we need those layers to build. It's like this idea of, I feel like by building the local foundation, it really raises awareness. It helps people claim their own rights, claim their own food sovereignty. That's a solid foundation. You can't take that away if it's built from the ground. So I feel like we've been de-skilled, we've been disempowered, we've been indoctrinated in so many ways, especially in the US. I've been around the world, not just India, every single place has been welcoming, every single house. I mean, in Haiti, a family just like welcomed me when I was having trouble, like had 7 kids, no like money, and was like feeding me. So yeah, we have a lot to learn. We need to build a foundation, and it might be very hard, and we're just starting small, but I think this kind of thing really is inspiring. And I think we have to do more of it. So that's why we're trying to do our part as a collective to build awareness and build a network. I've been reading your articles and following your work. for a long time. I wanted to ask you one more thing about what keeps you going in this work. It's not easy. You mentioned it's a long process. How do you stay motivated? How do you stay joyful, inspired, and inspiring others?
Well, I have to admit it's difficult, especially in the last few years. There's 2 or 3 things that actually keep me going. One is if one is visiting and working with communities that are doing some of the most amazing things on the ground in the most difficult situations, even communities being physically uprooted by so-called development projects and all of that, they retain their hope, they're still smiling, they're joking, they're feeding us, So if you're looking at that kind of thing where people in the most desperate situations are actually not giving up, then I ask myself, what right do I have to give up hope? So that's one thing. And it's inspiring. That inspiration keeps me. But the second thing is, I think, just the inspiration from the rest of nature. I live in a city, unfortunately, but even where I'm living, half a dozen different species of trees are flowering. And you'll always see a few bird species here and there. And there's the bird sounds in the early morning when I wake up. And I think if one has one's senses open to the rest of nature, and I'm deliberately saying senses, not just seeing and sounds, but all kinds of senses, including a spiritual sense, then there's always hope that nature is giving us. It's alive. Despite everything we're doing to it, it is still actually struggling, but managing to stay alive and give us the most beautiful things. So to me, these are the 2 things that keep me going. And the third one, which is youth. I mean, I started when I was quite young, 17, 16, 17 years old. And I'm seeing today 17, 18 years old, 20 years old, so-called Gen Z, also kind of coming up with their own responses to being frustrated with what's happening in their world, right? Now, some of those responses can be very problematic, but some are extremely inspiring. Some of what's happened, say, in Nepal or other places is inspiring. And I think for me, what's very important is to try and link with them in a way that is not top down and patronizing, but to say, okay, I'm available or we are available with our experiences to the extent you want to hear them. I was going to say this even in response to one of your early questions, is to say that some movements have been extremely successful in bringing down a regime, right? Or installing a new regime, which is revolutionary, etc. But because they haven't necessarily thought through some of what is it that they want post that change, some of the fundamental changes, you actually end up going more or less getting the same kind of authoritarian top-down structures. They might be better in welfare, but they're not necessarily better in other ways, right? So for me, it's very important to try and establish a dialogue with Gen Z and with the new and Gen A to say, how do we move beyond the frustrations and politics of regime change, which is important, to a politics of prefiguration, which is what's our own vision of a different society and what are young people's contributions to that. And I think this is where, unfortunately, the same corporations that are creating all the problems have kind of convinced us that if we just change our individual behavior a bit, the world will be saved. So, you have the, what's it called, the carbon footprint and so on and so forth, which I think British Petroleum started. So I'm supposed to be worried about my carbon footprint and not bother British Petroleum with its carbon footprint. And I think it's crucial that we try and behave as responsibly in our individual lives as possible in terms of consumption, behavior, etc. But that's only a first step, or it's only one step. You have to simultaneously also work as collectives. It could be a small youth club, it could be whatever, a neighborhood club or something. And that collective strength, which then enables the larger macro shifts, is as important or more important in that sense than an individual consumption change or individual behavior change. But so I would just say that as individuals, there's so much one can do. Everybody has some talent or the other. As an artist, as a poet, as a mobilizer, as a researcher, as a journalist, there's some talent or the other. And I think that all can be contributed to the pot of radical transformations that we want.
Thanks so much, Ashish, for joining us and for being our first guest. This was a perfect way to kick off a series of conversations about alternatives with Collective Now. With that, we'll wrap up today's episode. I hope to be back with you all very soon with another inspiring guest.